All right, go for it, Joanne.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about ADHD and what it all means. And so we're going to, how shall I tell you? Yeah, there you go. Next slide. So on the agenda today, we're going to talk about the definition of ADHD, and we're going to talk about the criteria, and then we're going to talk about 3 different ways to consider ADHD. And then we're going to look at the prognosis, and we're going to look at interventions, and then we'll have questions and answers. So next. Go ahead. All right, so for a definition, what you have to understand is that when you make a medical or psychological definition, when you create that, almost every single word in that definition has an additional meaning. So for instance, the American Psychological Association defined ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Now, disorder means something. It actually, in medicine, means it's a disturbance of normal functioning of your mind or body, or both. And diseases may be caused by genetic factors, and that's going to be important to think about later on as we talk about things, or trauma. And there's various kinds of trauma. We'll talk about those too. And that is from the National Medical Center, their understanding, their definition of the word disorder. So it's a disorder of a behavioral condition, which means that you're going to be able to see something happening, and that condition makes it difficult to focus on everyday requests or routines, stating that they can be challenging. So each one of these words that I've highlighted really carries a specific meaning with it. A behavioral condition, when you talk about behavioral health, what you really mean is how do the behaviors that a person demonstrates impact on their individual well-being? So mental health is primarily concerned with an individual's state of being. Now, the condition impacts one or both of these situations. So it's either a sense of physical well-being or mental well-being. And interfering with ordinary functioning sounds like it could be anywhere from very minor to very, very severe, which is exactly the case. And it literally means, the idea of normal functioning means you exist as a useful human being, you're functioning well. For instance, if you look up in the dictionary, non-functioning, it means to be out of work. And they actually use the word kaput. So you're just not functioning properly. And reflecting an inability to follow through means that I'm not able to develop a plan. I'm not able to even think about what really goes into the plan, develop the plan, and then follow through. And again, that can be very minor and it can be very severe. Next slide. Okay, so the prevalence and types of ADHD. Attention deficit hyperactive disorder occurs in approximately 8.4% of children. So if you think about that and just kind of rounding up, it could be anywhere from 10% of the kids that go to school. So if a teacher had a class of, say, 30 students, which is a large class, 3 of them could be expected to have ADHD. And when you think about that, how difficult it could be for a teacher with 3 kids with very extreme, maybe, needs in a classroom where she's responsible for teaching everybody. It's a tough situation. Now, from that 8.5%, when they become adults, only 2.5% identify themselves as ADHD. So we're going to figure out, where do they go? What happens to them, and how does that show itself? Next slide. Okay, so there's 3 ways to consider the ADHD process, and it's the impact on other people's behavior as well as the child. The first one is it can be used as an excuse for behavior. And there's 2 ways to look at that. Like, you can think about the tantruming child, but then there's another part of it that we'll take a look at as to why individuals actually want to be classified as ADHD. And when you think about excuse for a child's behavior, I've heard teachers say it, I've heard parents say it, you know, I can't fix that, he's ADHD, as if it becomes an excuse for us to allow certain behaviors to go on when we could be training children to learn how to deal with them. And we'll look at that later on as well. The second way to consider it is it's strictly an educational classification. And that means it impacts your ability to do work at school. And there are ways that we deal with that in terms of the classification process, which I'll talk about a little bit. And then the third thing is a medical diagnosis. And the medical diagnosis oftentimes is what's needed to get a school district to recognize the difficulties that a child has. So all three of these kind of interplay a bit, or can interplay, and we're going to take a look at them. But I just want to point out this little girl's face. Now, she looks like my daughter, actually. And you could look at a kid that's tantruming and think that they have ADHD, which they might. But you can also, there's a normal range of behavior that we could expect from children at various ages. So is it inappropriate for a child at maybe 6 years old to have a tantrum? Well, it might be inappropriate, but it's not abnormal. So we want to have a sense of caution as we go through this, that not every child who has some behaviors is ADHD. Next. Okay, so the ADHD label oftentimes can be used to explain a child's difficult behavior. And some children have other issues, a learning disability, a behavioral disorder. They could even be mildly autistic and show difficult behaviors that you're quick to say are ADHD. It can also be that a child has learned that certain behaviors get them what they want, and so it becomes part of an excuse. So educators have to really take a look at that carefully with parents to make sure this is really ADHD and not something else that we need to address. The other thing is ADHD for kids who are very, very hyperactive can really stretch parents and teachers' skills. And that's why it's so important that they work together. Next slide, please. Okay, so we talked about two ways that behavior can be considered as an excuse. And the first way was simply attributing all the child's behaviors to the fact that they have a classification or a diagnosis, and then kind of excusing it or not really working with the child to find the skills for them to improve their behavior. So the other way to look at this is that there is a true Adderall or stimulant advantage to taking some of the medication that's prescribed for ADHD students or children. And 20% of college students, now this is 2005, this information, 20% of college students use Ritalin or Adderall to study, write papers, and take exams. And while some people might say, well, that's an advantage and it helps me kind of crash study and get ahead. The downside is most of us would recognize that when you cram information, you don't retain it. So you may get the score you want on a test, but it's not going to help you in the field that you're endeavoring in. The other thing is that there's a rash of people wanting a prescription. So they get classified as ADHD, they get the prescription, then they use it for themselves, and they also sometimes sell it to other individuals. So that's a real concern, and physicians, psychologists, really, and parents should take a good hard look at, is it possible that my child or this child is abusing medication? And a really good quote from the New York Times article, ADHD medication does not increase your intelligence. It only increases your endurance, and that is short term. So the benefits to taking medication when you don't need it, while it currently is still a very big problem in universities and in high school, doesn't really get you anywhere in the long run. Next slide. Okay, so this is just to emphasize the fact that it's really critical that we think about how and when we assign medication use to a child. This is the warning label, I'll let you read it, that physicians get when they first agree to use certain medications with their patients. And this is about specific medications, not Adderall necessarily, but it does point out that it has a high potential for abuse and dependency. So what starts out in the short run as, let me get a kick to my energy so I can cram, winds up being very abusive. Next slide. Okay, so we talked about the excuses and the abuses of stimulants and the label to get stimulants. The second one is an educational classification, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail, but here's what I want you to understand. The first step in an educational process is that the child has to be identified. And that child can be identified by absolutely anybody. It could be a CASA, it can be a parent, a teacher, an assistant, anybody who thinks there's a concern for this child's education. And that includes emotional support, academic gains as well. Once a child's identified, the very first thing that the school district is required by law to do is something called RTI, response to intervention. And so if you made a referral, you identified a student and the school district looked at the records, the first thing they would have to do is say, we're not going any further until we see if there's something in the environment, something that we can change that will enable the student to proceed with the academic progress. If that doesn't happen, rather if they investigate and it's not the environment, then a referral is made. All kinds of assessments are done in any area of suspected disability. A classification occurs, which is the process of identifying the label that a child is going to require in order to obtain services. And for ADHD, usually it's other health impaired, not all the time. So if you have a child that they're suspecting of ADHD, you may want to understand why the school district chose a certain classification. And then ultimately out of that, they should have appropriate interventions provided to the child. And I can't tell you enough how much I endorse behavioral intervention plans. And again, that's a big topic for another day, but it is a systematic way of evaluating how can I help the child change up their behavior, or how can I manipulate the environment to facilitate the child's needs. Next. Okay, so some symptoms of inattentive ADHD in children. So you have inattentive and you have hyperactive, and they're both ADHD, but they're two different ways of looking at it. So the DMS-5, just in case anybody doesn't know what it is a manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use to understand what the criteria for various diagnoses are. And so according to the DSM-5, inattention can be diagnosed in children under age 16 if they exhibit 6 or more of the following. And I'll let you read those as we talk about them. The 5 out of 6 or 6 out of 7 symptoms are determined, but usually by parents, teachers, assistants, individuals that know the child well, filling out an inventory. And that inventory is then graded or accounts for the individual's opinions of how this child behaves, how many symptoms they have. And then we combine the information to find out, does it only happen in one environment? Does it happen all over? If it happens frequently across the board, the likelihood is that that child is ADHD. Okay, go ahead. So the symptoms of hyperactive children, or hyperactivity in children, is much more obvious. They're the kid that can't wait to answer the teacher's question. They might be in the back of the room raising their hand saying, oh, pick me, pick me. And then when they don't get picked, they blurt out the answer anyway. They're wiggle worms. They fidget a lot. They're the kids with the legs going. What else? Let's see. They have trouble waiting their turn. They often jump into conversations without understanding really what the conversation is about. And so they blurt things into the conversation that might embarrass them. People may laugh instead of understanding that I'm just excited to be here and I want to contribute. Next screen, please. Okay. So understanding ADHD, the symptoms and behaviors, essentially a person with ADHD has difficulties concentrating and paying attention in the classroom. And can you click on that, or do I?
Yeah, let me try. Yep, I think I can.
Okay.
Let's test our technology knowledge here.
Okay.
What many teachers don't know about ADHD.
I don't see the picture.
ADHD is an iceberg. According to Chris A. Ziegler Dendy, just 10% of its
Do you see a picture?
visible to the naked
Oh, I see.
eye.
Hold on.
Most teachers recognize hallmark signs like hyperactivity, impulsivity, inattention, but its lesser known invisible challenges are easy to blame on laziness or disobedience. Use this guide to explain beneath the surface ADHD attributes that are commonly misunderstood at school. 1. Developmental delays. Kids with ADHD mature at a slower pace. Their brain development can lag 2 to 3 years behind their peers. A 15-year-old with ADHD may act like a 12-year-old socially and emotionally. 2. Impaired executive functioning. Executive functions help kids plan, prioritize, and execute daily tasks. When they are weak, students have trouble with remembering homework or the rules, keeping track of due dates, getting started on boring tasks, sticking with difficult projects, and retrieving facts or information. 3. Emotional dysregulation. ADHD impairs a child's ability to regulate feelings, anger, anxiety, or sadness. Students with ADHD may have overblown reactions to setbacks that seem small and then struggle to calm down. 4. Coexisting conditions. Roughly half of all students with ADHD also have a second condition, like a learning disability, anxiety, depression, or oppositional defiant disorder. The first step towards greater learning is a comprehensive diagnosis and more complete understanding.
Okay.
All right, give me 1 second and I'll go right back to the PowerPoint. You share. Cool.
Okay, go back one more.
Great.
Okay, so what I want to point out in this that I think is critical is that over 50, somewhere between 50 and 67% of all children that are classified with ADHD, according to this information, have a conduct disorder. So a conduct disorder is a whole nother diagnosis. And the importance of determining what a child needs early on, like I'm saying preschool, kindergarten, first grade, early on. If they have these behaviors, they're pretty extreme. If you can see this behavior in a child that young, it's pretty serious. And so it becomes imperative that you figure out what are the triggers that make this child upset. Because going down the route of a conduct disorder means you've been hurt a lot of times. You've been embarrassed. You've been rejected. You've felt less than. You have low self-esteem. You don't see good, solid answers. You have poor planning. So it's critical that we really get to these kids early on and understand what they need. And that's why the BIP, the Behavior Intervention Plan, is so critical. You can ask for a BIP, and it's pretty hard for a school district to turn you down. So if you have a child, especially a younger child, but even older on, you still want it, that you see and can document pretty serious attention deficit behaviors, you want to make sure that you get the BIP so that they understand what is going on with this child that triggers them and in what environments. And you can start a whole series of more positive outcomes rather than building and waiting till all the negative happens and then you've got another diagnosis. Okay, next screen, thanks. So what happens in the negative sense to children that are ADHD and become adults? And so some of the symptoms that you will see in adults that are still struggling with ADHD are extreme distractibility. So to explain that, the best way that I can explain it is to say, you know how sometimes you might get in a car and you're driving, you have to go for like a half hour, and you're driving and you get to where you're going to go and you say, oh my goodness, how did I get here? I wasn't even, right? Like you're on autopilot and you're just driving and you get there, but you've been thinking about something else the whole time. So imagine a person being in a large conference room and the boss is giving a presentation and he says the word pretzel. And you're sitting there and you're kind of, oh yeah, pretzel. Oh, I love pretzels. You know what? I bet you I should pick some up. And you're off on your own little thing about pretzels instead of the example that he was using that we're all in a pretzel, right? Kind of deal. That's kind of what it's like to be easily distracted from what you're attempting. The other thing is they have a restlessness. They have trouble relaxing. So these are people that are always on the go, even when they may be sharing a TV movie with you. They're up and they're getting food, and then they're on their phone and they're doing things. They're just very, very restless. They have trouble getting organized. So I know a person who's extremely successful in business. And I also know he had pretty severe ADHD as a kid. And I asked him, I said, how do you manage? And he said, I get really good secretaries. And so they keep me on track. They keep me organized. They point me in the direction I have to go. And they even tell me when I have to get started on a task. So for instance, getting started on a task, if somebody had ADHD, they have trouble prioritizing. They have trouble determining just how much time it's going to take to do something. They oftentimes overestimate or underestimate, and so they're caught in a jam where they're not prepared, kind of thing. For people who succeed in handling this, they might be assigned a task at work, and they figure out, okay, this is going to take me 40 hours, but I don't have 40 hours this week. It's due in a month. So I'm going to set aside 1 day a week, and I'm going to clear my calendar so that I can just do this and get it done on time. So they really knuckle down into time sharing, time planning, prioritizing, and we'll figure out even complicated ways to say what's a number 1 priority and what's a number 3 priority. But they figure out things. Now, if they don't have those skills, if they haven't been taught them early on, that it's not part of their repertoire, serious difficulties can happen, and people wind up losing jobs. They also wind up late for things. They wind up, one of the things that stays pretty consistent is that kids who are hyperactive learn to enjoy kind of like an adrenaline rush. So they become risk takers, and you might find them, they're rock climbers, they're skiers, they're things that many people would say, well, that's a little risky for me. They engage in it. Including driving cars. So you may see people that you know as adults that are ADHD are kind of reckless. They get a lot of tickets. They also, and I'll explain this later, are prone to being angry, having angry outbursts. And so you can see that funnels right into marital problems and relationship problems in general. So you could see the negative symptoms, or the symptoms rather, of ADHD can be very harmful to the individual if they're not able to incorporate a skill set that enables them to succeed. Next screen, please. Okay, so we talked about the educational system. We talked about the abuses and excuses for using ADHD. Now we're going to talk about the medical model. And for the medical model, to be diagnosed with ADHD, your child must have 6 or more symptoms of inattentiveness or 6 or more symptoms of hyperactivity. Now, on the previous screens, those were the 6, actually 7 or 8 symptoms for each of those. And to be diagnosed, the child also has to be displaying the symptoms for more than 6 months. That's important because I have seen a number of people when their children get to like the beginning of junior year in high school, the parents are seeking a diagnosis because guess what? It gives you things like extra time on tests. It gives you scribes. It could give you all kinds of advantages to standardized test taking that might help you get better scores and therefore perhaps an opportunity to get into the college of your choice. The other thing is these symptoms have to be apparent and diagnosed as in recorded somewhere before the age of 12. The interesting part, currently, if you go to a physician or if you go to a school and try to get a child diagnosed or an individual diagnosed, there is no blood test. There is no physical exam that can be done for ADHD that documents for us that the child or the individual has ADHD. In fact, what we rely on are the completed inventory forms for individuals who know the child or the individual spouse, parent, grandparent, teacher, assistant, anybody that knows the child well enough to be able to document those behaviors. Next, please. Okay, so here again, the symptoms of attention deficit are careless mistakes, missing details, difficulty sustaining attention, poor listener. Let me just say that one of the things that when the little vibrators first came out for kids, you know, for whatever they use them for, we used them in schools on vibrate. So the kid would put it in his pocket, it would just vibrate and let him know, where's my mind? So every 10 minutes or so during a class, that's what they would do. Now the kids use their phones, so they don't have to carry another appliance around. Everybody knows you got a phone. They don't know why it's vibrating, but you know, if they do happen to hear it, it's all cool, and the kids can kind of get themselves back on track. Okay. Difficulty organizing. We have all kinds of methods in school to help a kid organize. And the real benefit to this, if you get it young enough, is you're teaching the skills that they're going to need to be able to implement themselves as they're become adults. So then hyperactive, fidgeting, squirming, difficulty remaining quiet, often interrupts others, blurts out answers, always on the go, difficulty waiting turns, and talks excessively. We probably know some kids like this, right? Now there's a third avenue here, and it's your combined. So your ADHD, you're both attention deficit and hyperactive. And typically you're more one than the other. But if you have symptoms of both, it's called combined. And then there's a rating for them, mild, moderate, severe. So that would be based on how much does it interfere with your ordinary daily life functioning. And there's a criteria for those. And then in remission. So there are children who have been diagnosed with ADHD, are fortunate enough to have solid adults around them that help them figure out the interventions that they personally need to succeed. And then they're tested again, and guess what? It's not affecting them because they've succeeded in managing it. Excuse me. And then there's also something called partial remission, which is maybe the hyperactive stuff is gone, but the attention deficit is still there, or some combination of that. Next screen, please. Okay, so this is earth-shattering. This is brain imaging that we use to compare samples of children with ADHD and ADD. I'm sorry, no ADHD and ADD. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see that in the front part of the brain, and the front is facing the word no ADHD. You'll see that there's all kinds of orange going on, and that's the prefrontal lobe, and it's the cortex going all the way around. You'll see the orange. That is growth, okay? That's what that's signifying. Now, in the skull or in the brain of the child that has ADHD, we now can see first what we've been saying all along, that there's developmental delays. And what that means is I'm going to use the word immature, but I simply mean I haven't grown enough. So the brain is immature for the actual years that the child has lived. And so you see a smaller brain, and you also see less activity. And in the back, the cerebellum is in the back, and it weighs or takes up only 10% of the volume of a human brain, but it is responsible for holding or transferring 80% of the neurons in the brain, which the neurons process information. They send it out. It's like a transport. So you can see if these children are in the same age group, right? They're both, say, 12 years old. One is probably functioning like a 9-year-old, and the other is likely functioning at age appropriate. But you can see expecting the same behavior from these two children is really putting one child at a disadvantage, which is the reason for the special ed interventions and if appropriate, the medical interventions, the medicine, if it's appropriate. Next slide, please. So this kind of explains it. And basically, when you say something is correlated, you're just saying it happens at the same time. You're not saying it's the cause, it causes it. We don't have enough information to know that it's anything more than a correlate. So in the previous study that I just showed you, it was an international study completed and published in July of 2022. So it's just out there. And they examined, they did the MRIs on over 1,500 children that did not have ADHD and 1,700 children that did have ADHD. And so these are their findings. They're saying that there is a reduction in the level of neurotransmitters, these two particular ones, and they affect the prefrontal. Would you go back to the other slide? So they affect the prefrontal lobe and the cerebellum back here. So you can see the cerebellum, one of the things that it does is it manages movement, it manages balance, it manages any kind of bodily processing in terms of the movement. So whether you're fidgety, whether you're overactive, all of that stuff comes out of this back region. And in the front part, that's where you plan, you think about something, you plan something, you are able to process it in such a way that you can follow through. So you can see tremendous difficulty. But here's, to me, what's really important. This part goes way deep into the brain, by the brain stem, right by the bottom of your neck going up. And the brain parts that are attached there are called sometimes the primitive brain. They regulate a lot of emotional response. So to think about this, perhaps you've gone to reach for something and you realize the water's hot in the pot and it's going to burn you, and you pull your hand back. Well, you pull your hand back and then you say, wow, I almost burned myself, because it never got up to the prefrontal cortex. It stopped, and it stopped around the amygdala. And that part of your brain, the older portion of your brain, is responsible for deciding whether I'm going to send information up or I'm going to act on it. So you can see if that part of your system is not as developed as someone else's, you're going to be more impulsive. A lot of stuff is not going to get all the way up. You're going to act on it. And so there are behavioral social programs that you can introduce to kids to help them regulate better. All right. Okay, next, and skip that one. You can skip that. Okay. So what we do know is much of, or oftentimes, I'll say it that way, ADHD from these MRIs impacts the right side of your brain, your right hemisphere, more than it does your left hemisphere. Now, that's not always the case, but it's often the case. And so here are things that help you understand how a child's ADHD might impact them. It impacts intuitive thought. It impacts holistic perception, understanding the big picture of things. It impacts your emotional thought. It impacts nonverbal adventures. You can call those daydreams. So children can go off, right, pretty easily. It impacts creativity, writing, imagination, left side motor skills. So the right side of your brain controls your left side. So interesting enough, many children, above 50% of the children diagnosed with ADHD are left-handed. And again, that's a correlation. That is not a cause. Next. Okay, so what causes ADHD? And we actually don't know. We do know that there is a tremendously strong genetic component. And as the studies, the MRI studies go on, and there'll be more, we may be able to actually look at parent brains and children's brains. Sometimes it's a sibling of a parent that has ADHD, but very, very often somebody in the sibling level of parents has ADHD. So that we know that there's a pretty strong genetic correlation. We don't know, like, is it on this gene, or we don't know that yet. But besides genetics, there are risk factors, and these risk factors include complicated and premature deliveries. So if a child was delivered prematurely and their brain was less developed than a typically developed infant, you can see that that could possibly continue for a number of years. Somewhere around, usually by no later than the age 25, a person's brain has fully developed. So you can see that perhaps with ADHD, it might take a person into their 30s before they kind of get it all together. And that's not uncommon. Brain injuries are, again, these are risk factors and correlates. Prenatal exposure to drugs, alcohol, and addictive substances. Now that would be on the mother, but they have some evidence that even with the father doing drugs at the time of fertilization, we believe things can carry from the father now as well. And exposure to harmful environmental toxins, especially during birth. So things in the air, things in your environment, in your work office or your home, can all potentially impact. Next. Okay, so the effects of ADHD meds on the human body. I'm going to let you take a look at this, but realistically, it does improve attention span. It does also cause some level of withdrawal and lower attention span when you are withdrawing. Dry mouth, we talked about, shortness of breath. So it's an amphetamine, and depending on whether you actually need it or not, it has a different impact. And so you might have to have your physician consider changing up your medication if you're getting a lot of shortness of breath. Loss of appetite, we talked about that. Nervousness. Now, again, it's a stimulant. So you can see if you're taking ADHD medication and you're already hyperactive, you can see that possibly the nervousness would really exacerbate. Cold toes. I didn't know that one, but yeah, cold toes. Slowed growth. We knew that. Impulse control. Depending on the medication, it can, if it's effective, really slow down that impulse control. Constricted blood vessels, not necessarily a good thing. Increased heart rate, again, it's a stimulant. Sleeping problems also correlates with stimulants. So, I think the little clip that we saw said, gauge when you are coming down off your medication and make sure that you have enough time before you go to sleep that you're able to do that. Okay. And so basically, the medication impacts your central nervous system. So it's going to go throughout your body. It's going to impact everything. Next. Oh, you do what?
Do you want me to try that video?
Yeah. Oh, we only have 8 minutes left or so. Yeah. Go ahead and do it.
That's right.
I think I can.
No problem. Let me share this way. Okay.
5 common side effects of ADHD medications and fixes. The threat of potential side effects keeps many parents and adults from trying ADHD medication. Most side effects lessen with time. When there is a small problem with a med, you have to decide which is better, to live with a side effect for a bit or with the child's inability to focus. Terry Dixon, MD. Here are the most common adverse reactions and ways to mitigate each. 1. Stomach problems. Decreased appetite, weight loss, upset stomach. When a child starts medication, there can be a 1 to 3 pound weight loss in the first month, Dixon says. However, it is common for the child to gain back the weight over the next 3 months. To help, Have healthy snacks and meals on hand to feed your child whenever she is hungry. Plan to eat before medication kicks in or after it wears off. Take medication with food or milk. 2. Insomnia. No electronics at least 1 hour before bedtime. Use a white noise machine or soft music for relaxation. Consider changing your medication dosage or timing. 3. Irritability and mood changes. Irritability while on medication can be a side effect of the drug or a sign that a child may have another disorder, Dixon says. Work with your doctor to add a small second dose to avoid the rebound when meds wear off. Consider an evaluation for a related condition like anxiety. 4. Headaches. Giving Tylenol or Motrin as appropriate, Dixon says. If headaches persist, discuss changing the dosage with your doctor. 5. Dry mouth. Carry a water bottle. Suck on sugarless candies. If side effects persist and/or impact daily life and overall health, speak with your doctor about other medication options.
It's a
Oops. Perfect. All right.
If you shop at Walmart,
no.
you get it. You eat better by cooking affordable ingredients.
I
And you
never
shop
get it.
smarter by ordering them online for pickup or delivery.
Stop advertising. Sorry about that, guys. There we go. We should be back to the PowerPoint.
Okay, so here's my point. The medication, when effective, is helpful and gives the child a chance to slow themselves down so that they can incorporate the information that the parents and teachers around them are trying to help them with. If it's abused or if it's not correctly prescribed, it can cause serious problems. And if I am irritable and I'm yelled at and the medication is making things worse, you can see that this can spiral out of control. So it really becomes important that the kid has a group of adults around them that really can reach out and help them with patience. That's probably the biggest thing, not losing your own cool and having patience with the child. Okay, next screen, please. Okay, so here's our recommendation. To help a child with ADHD, if you can persuade the parent and the child to go to therapy, that's the most helpful. Having a child with ADHD is not, it requires more than the normal skill set that we learn as parents. It requires more than that, and getting somebody to help you figure it out is a good thing. Get help from the school, either an IEP or a 504. 504 is another option beyond special ed, but if you are diagnosed by a physician with ADHD, your school can help you out through that process. And then get medical advice and medication if it's warranted. And I have seen people who know that they're ADHD, the parents knew that they were ADHD, refused the medication and said, we are going to figure this out anyway. And as adults, these people that I have spoken to or interviewed are grateful that their parents did it, because they did cause them to learn to control things themselves. That is not always the case. So it's really a judgment call. You have to get as much information as you can possibly get and surround yourself with good, helpful people. Next. Okay, so the prognosis for ADHD first, we don't have a cure for it. The symptoms into adulthood are that 25% of the children diagnosed with ADHD are on meds as children, 25% of them. Out of that 25% of those children, 80% of them will need meds as teenagers and 50% will need meds as adults. So it's an ongoing problem. Medication seems to be a pretty substantial solution for many, many individuals, but my opinion, I don't think it's sufficient. I think you have to learn skills along the way that will help you better navigate whatever your life is. So if left untreated, it can gravely interfere with social and educational performance. it generally impairs self-esteem. 25% of ADHD children develop conduct disorder problems and can lead to antisocial personality, substance abuse, and criminal behavior. Individuals are prone to depression, anxiety, and suicidal tendencies. So you can see it is not something to take lightly. It is not something to use as an excuse for someone's behavior. It really requires that we come together and figure out an ongoing solution as the child ages. Next. Okay, so if it's treated early and consistently, people with ADHD lead fulfilling lives. Many of them are naturally talented and go on to become successful artists, businessmen, public speakers, inventors, and sportsmen in particular. Let me just say that most research has come out and found that most really good batters, baseball batters, have ADHD and are able to, they'll tell you, they actually can see that ball coming at them. Now, the ball is coming 90 miles an hour, it's how small, and they can see it. And they say time slows down. That's how they can see it. And they're great baseball players for it. So if you want to read about it, there's a book called The Gift of Dyslexia. And they really explain it beautifully in that book, how very successful people have simply learned, this is what I'm good at, and this is how I'm going to get there. And they do it, and they're remarkable. Most excel in occupations that require a high level of energy, provides independence, and allows freedom of expression. And some people require something quieter, a quieter scenario. Okay, next. Okay, so how is it that ADHD has not been bred out of the gene pool? What we're talking about is like, here's this thing that makes it so difficult for kids, and they probably have a parent that has it. So why do people, all of us without ADHD, find these individuals interesting enough that we marry them and have children, right? So that's the question. Why are they still in the gene pool? And if we have time, I have one more video. Do we have time? I can just talk through it if you want me to.
If you don't mind, just so we have time for questions.
Sure. So here's the big picture. People with ADHD who learn how to cope with whatever their particular shortcomings are. And first of all, they're usually pretty bright. They can do tremendous things. And let me just tell you that here are some of the people. Albert Einstein, you probably know about, Ryan Gosling, Bill Gates, Eric Brockovich, the woman who became the attorney for or the attorney assistant for individuals that had been poisoned by large manufacturers, Pablo Picasso, Agatha Christie, Babe Ruth, Mozart, Walt Disney, John F. Kennedy. And so here's what I want to put out there for you to think about. Remember that handsome guy? He was kind of impulsive. He was very spontaneous. He was athletic. He was talkative. He had kind of like a dreamy quality. Maybe if a girl dropped her purse, he picked it up for her. He just was so interesting. Well, that's the ADHD guy. And that's why we fell in love with them, and that's why we procreated, and they have great contributions to make to society. We simply need to help them and nurture them along the way. And so thank you for your time.
All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. So if this is our kind of Q&A section. So feel free to let me know if anybody has any questions. And I will start with one as some of you kind of think about your questions, because we've got a couple of minutes to ask questions. But Joanne, you talked about that, I forget the percentage necessarily, but that a pretty high percentage of folks who are diagnosed with ADHD also have a second condition. How do you go about figuring out if and what the second condition is?
Right. So let's talk about, well, we can do it a couple of different ways. If you're going for a medical diagnosis, then the individual who's diagnosing you, the psychologist, psychiatrist, social worker, whomever, that individual is going to look at what are the manifestations of behavior. So let's say, for instance, a child's referred to you for bullying. Okay. There's no criteria in ADHD that calls for bullying. And bullying is a certain type of behavior. Generally, it's learned. We assume it's learned. So we would say we need to look at something else. Let's say, for instance, that a child comes to you and you notice that their speech is off. There's no criteria in ADHD that talks about speech. So you would look at a speech diagnosis. So that's what you're looking at. If it's a behavior disorder or a learning disorder or anxiety. Now, anxiety, you're going to look. There's different kinds of anxiety, and you'd look at the specific criteria for each one of those types of anxiety to see, can I differentiate? Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right. Any questions? You can either come off mute or put it in the chat and I can read your question. Erica, I see you raise your hand. Why don't you come on off mute and ask your question?
Okay. Hello.
Hi.
I had a question more so about, you were talking about coping skills a lot. Can you talk about building a team for a child who has ADHD? What kind of supports are out there to build this team to help with coping skills?
So your school district or the child's school district should be able to provide these for you. But if I were setting up the team, I would look first for an occupational therapist who can do a good evaluation and help me understand what part of this neurological set of symptoms could she help me with? Can she give me, or he give me, ideas of how to help the child in the classroom? So for instance, we use weighted vests, we use fidget toys, we use bouncing ball, we use all kinds of things that the occupational therapist might be able to help you with to calm the child down. So the other person that I would bring in is a good therapist, whether it's a school-based therapist or an outside agency-based therapist, somebody who could talk to the child without any punishment ramifications and say, what does it feel like for you every day? What things are bad for you? What things are good for you? What do you need more of? Those kinds of things. Certainly a teacher that can kind of bring this kid under her or his wing. A case manager that can really keep on top of things and pull everybody together. And that's just the beginning. You can span out from that. There's all kinds of services that the school can offer, or you could ask for. So for instance, there are coping skills classes, there are executive functioning groups, there are social groups, there are all kinds of things that you could involve a child in so that they learn from their peers while everybody is learning together.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question if anybody else has a question.
Okay.
All right. Well, awesome. Thank you, Joanne, so much for doing this. This was so incredibly helpful. So thank you. And thank you for everybody who attended today as well.